East Oakland, California. In 1985, Felix Wayne Mitchell Jr., known across the streets as Felix the Cat, was a 31-year-old drug kingpin from the San Antonio Village housing projects. By that time, he was already serving as the central leader of a powerful heroin distribution network that operated from the 69th Avenue projects, an area many residents called 69ville. What began as a small street operation had grown into one of the most organized drug networks in the region. The San Antonio Village housing projects had a reputation for deep poverty and long years of neglect. The buildings were aging and poorly maintained. Streets were cracked and businesses were scarce. Many families struggled to find steady work, and young people often grew up with few opportunities beyond the blocks where they were raised. It was a place where hope could be hard to find, and where survival often required toughness. In this environment, tension was constant. Rival groups competed for influence, territory, and respect. Violence was never far away, and the drug trade had become a powerful underground economy. For many young men in East Oakland, the legal path toward success felt closed. As a result, the streets became a different kind of system, one that rewarded risk, loyalty, and ambition. By the mid-1980s, Felix Mitchell had become one of the most visible figures in that system. His name carried weight across Oakland's neighborhoods. People spoke about him not only as a dealer but as a man who had built an organization that reached far beyond the housing projects where he grew up. The environment rewarded those who could control territory and maintain loyalty among their crews. Those who showed strength and leadership often gained power. But the same environment punished weakness quickly and violently. A person who could not defend his influence could lose everything overnight. Felix Mitchell understood these rules. Instead of operating as a small-time dealer on a corner, he treated the drug trade like a structured business. His organization had suppliers, distributors, and trusted lieutenants. This approach gave him control over large parts of the heroin market in East Oakland. At the same time, local and federal authorities were watching closely. Law enforcement agencies such as the Oakland Police Department, the FBI, and the DEA were gathering evidence against him and his network. To them, Mitchell represented a major criminal force responsible for spreading drugs and violence throughout the city. But within the neighborhoods where he had grown up, his image was more complicated. Some people feared him, while others admired him. In a place where many residents felt forgotten by the system, Felix Mitchell had become a figure who could not easily be ignored. By the late 1970s, Felix Mitchell had already established himself as the dominant drug trafficker in East Oakland. His organization, known as the 69 Mob, operated with structure and discipline that few other street groups had at the time. Instead of scattered dealers working alone, the network functioned more like a corporation. Mitchell had grown up in the same housing projects that later became the center of his operation. As a young man, he dropped out of high school and faced the same limited options as many others in his neighborhood. Jobs were rare and economic opportunities were few. The projects offered little support for young people who wanted to move beyond their surroundings. Rather than leaving, Felix Mitchell turned the neighborhood into his base of power. He organized friends and younger residents into a group he called My Other Brother, a name that reflected the loyalty he expected within his circle. Over time, that group became the foundation of the 69 Mob. Felix carried himself with a calm but commanding presence. His confidence was visible in the way he dressed and moved through the neighborhood. He wore expensive suits, fur coats, and diamond jewelry. Luxury cars moved through streets where most residents struggled to pay rent. These displays of wealth created a powerful image. For many young people in the projects, that image meant something important. They saw someone from their own neighborhood who had gained power and influence in a world that often ignored them. Among local youth, Felix Mitchell represented success in a system where traditional paths had failed. But the organization he built was not limited to Oakland. Through connections with suppliers in Los Angeles, Mitchell created supply lines that brought heroin into the Bay Area. The drugs were processed, packaged, and distributed through networks of dealers who operated across multiple states. The structure of his operation was unusual for that time. There were managers who supervised certain areas, distributors who handled sales, and armed lieutenants who enforced discipline. Even the packaging of the drugs carried identifiable markings, giving the product a recognizable brand. Within the community, Mitchell also cultivated loyalty by giving money and gifts to residents. He sponsored youth sports programs, donated to local causes, and provided assistance to families in need. These actions created a complicated reputation. Some residents viewed him as a provider who helped the neighborhood when others did not. At the same time, rival gangs saw his growing power as a threat. Groups such as Milton Mickey Moore's organization known as the Family, and Harvey Wissington's gang Funktown USA, competed for territory and influence in Oakland's drug trade. Tensions between these organizations slowly grew into violent confrontations. For law enforcement, Felix Mitchell represented a dangerous new model of organized street crime. His network had structure, discipline, and reach that extended beyond a single neighborhood. Investigators believed that removing him would weaken the drug trade in Oakland. Yet among the people who lived inside the same housing projects where Mitchell had grown up, the story was not so simple. To some, he was a criminal leader responsible for spreading drugs and violence. To others, he was a powerful figure who had risen from the same streets they walked every day. By the mid-1980s, Felix Mitchell stood at the center of this contradiction. He was both feared and respected, both a target of law enforcement and a figure of influence in his own community. His rise from a forgotten housing project to a powerful drug boss had already become a story that people across Oakland would remember for years to come. But not everyone respected Felix Mitchell. In the violent world of Oakland's drug trade, power always attracted challengers. As Mitchell's organization grew stronger, other groups began to see his control as something that could be taken. One figure in particular, Milton Moore, also known as Mickey Mo, embodied that danger. Moore was the leader of a rival crew called the Family, a group determined to compete with the 69 mob for control of Oakland's drug market. Before entering the drug trade, Moore had been known as an R&B singer. He had musical talent and a path that might have led him away from crime. But over time he moved into the world of drugs and built his own organization on the streets of Oakland. His crew gained a reputation for toughness and loyalty, and they refused to accept Mitchell's growing monopoly over the heroin trade. Moore was known for challenging powerful rivals. Instead of avoiding conflict, he pushed directly into contested territory. His group operated with confidence and often tested the limits of Mitchell's authority. This made the rivalry between the two organizations especially dangerous. Moore believed that no single man should control the drug trade in Oakland. To him, the streets were open ground, and any crew strong enough to hold territory deserved to profit from it. That belief put him directly against Felix Mitchell's system of control. The rivalry was not limited to Moore's group. Another organization, Funktown USA, led by Harvey Wissington, also competed for influence in the city. These three groups, the 69 Mob, the Family, and Funktown USA, operated in the same environment, watching one another carefully. At first, the tension appeared as small confrontations. Dealers moved into blocks controlled by rivals. Arguments broke out over territory. Threats were exchanged quietly through intermediaries. But everyone involved understood that the balance could break at any moment. Moore and his associates had already learned how the street system worked. Violence often happened without immediate punishment. Witnesses were afraid to speak. Evidence was difficult to gather. The streets had their own rules, and those rules allowed dangerous men to operate with little interference for long periods of time. Because of this, Moore and others like him began to believe that the system could not stop them. If they moved carefully and kept their distance from direct involvement, the risk of consequences remained low. In that environment, bold actions could bring both power and reputation. Milton Mickey Moore and other rival figures were able to continue their activities by exploiting weaknesses within the system. The drug trade operated in neighborhoods where police resources were stretched thin and community trust in law enforcement was often low. Investigations took time, and many crimes remained difficult to prove in court. Witnesses rarely came forward. Many residents feared retaliation if they spoke openly about what they had seen. Others believed that cooperating with authorities could bring danger to their families. This silence allowed violent groups to continue operating while law enforcement struggled to build strong cases against them. At the same time, the illegal economy had already taken root in the neighborhood. Drugs created fast money in communities where legitimate opportunities were scarce. Young people were recruited into crews as lookouts or runners. The system fed itself, growing larger as more individuals became involved. Authorities were aware of the growing problem, but their response was slow and complicated. Federal and local agencies had to gather evidence, build informant networks, and track financial records. These investigations often took years before arrests could be made. During that time, rival gangs continued competing for territory. The lack of immediate consequences created a dangerous belief among many street leaders. They began to think that they could operate freely as long as they avoided direct exposure. Over time, figures like Moore came to believe they were untouchable. The same belief spread among other groups across Oakland streets. Power came from reputation, and reputation grew through bold action. As tensions increased between the rival organizations, the city moved closer to open conflict. The fragile balance that had existed between the '69 mob, the family, and Funktown, USA was beginning to collapse. What had once been quiet competition was slowly turning into something far more violent. The first clear sign of disrespect did not begin with gunfire. It began during an ordinary moment on the streets of East Oakland, where daily routines often carried deeper meaning for those who understood the rules of the drug trade. By the late 1970s, the '69 mob, led by Felix Mitchell, controlled large parts of the heroin market in East Oakland. Dealers working under Mitchell operated on specific corners, and most rival groups avoided those locations. The arrangement was not written anywhere, but it was widely understood. Territory meant money, and crossing into another crew's territory could quickly lead to violence. One evening, dealers connected to Milton Mickey Mo Moore's organization, known as the Family, began appearing on corners that were normally controlled by the '69 mob. They stood openly in the same areas where Mitchell's runners had sold heroin for years. The move was quiet but very deliberate. No gunshots were fired. No threats were shouted across the street. Instead, Moore's people simply began conducting business on those corners. Customers who arrived to buy heroin noticed the change immediately. Some buyers were confused. Others understood exactly what was happening. In the world of street territory, presence alone could be a challenge. When word reached the members of the '69 mob, many were shocked. For years, Felix Mitchell had maintained control over those blocks. Smaller dealers rarely dared to compete directly with his network. His reputation alone had been enough to keep rivals away. But Moore's crew had crossed that invisible line. The message was simple. The monopoly that Felix Mitchell had built in East Oakland was no longer going unchallenged. Within hours, the information reached Mitchell himself. His lieutenants reported that Moore's dealers were selling openly in areas that belonged to the '69 mob. Some members of his organization believed this was the beginning of something larger. They expected a quick response. In many street organizations, a challenge like this would be answered immediately. Rival dealers might be forced off the corner, threatened, or attacked. Quick retaliation often served as a warning to others who might consider similar actions. But Felix Mitchell reacted differently. He listened to the reports, asked questions, and then chose not to respond right away. The decision surprised several people inside his organization. To them, the situation looked like open disrespect. Allowing another crew to operate on their corners risked damaging the reputation of the '69 mob. Yet Mitchell remained calm. Instead of sending his men into immediate confrontation, he continued observing the situation. He wanted to see how far Moore's crew would go and whether the move was temporary or the start of a larger challenge. On the streets, however, silence often creates its own message. Residents of East Oakland began noticing the change in activity. Dealers from different groups now stood only a short distance apart. Customers could choose between sellers, something that had not happened often when Mitchell controlled the market. Rumors began spreading quickly. Some people said that Felix Mitchell might be losing his control over the heroin trade. Others believed that Moore's organization had grown strong enough to challenge him directly. The small act of standing on a rival corner had become something more than a routine event. It had turned into a public test of power. And for the moment, Felix Mitchell chose patience instead of retaliation. To those watching from outside, that patience looked like weakness. But inside, the quiet decision was the beginning of something much larger. Among the people closest to Felix Mitchell, the reaction was very different from what outsiders believed. Members of the '69 mob had worked under Mitchell for years. They had seen how he built his organization and how carefully he managed conflicts with rivals. Many of them expected a response, but they also understood that Mitchell rarely acted without studying the situation first. Still, the challenge from Moore's crew created tension inside the organization. Several lieutenants believed that allowing the rival dealers to remain on those corners could damage the reputation of the group. Street authority depended heavily on perception. If other gangs believed the '69 mob would not defend its territory, more groups might attempt the same thing. Some younger members pushed for immediate action. They believed that removing Moore's dealers quickly would restore the balance and remind everyone who controlled the area. But Felix Mitchell did not rush. Instead, he continued gathering information about the situation. He wanted to know how many people Moore had placed in those areas and whether other gangs might be supporting the move. Those who knew Mitchell well recognized this pattern. He often preferred patience over sudden reaction. His organization had survived for years because he avoided unnecessary exposure to law enforcement and large public conflicts. To Mitchell, control meant discipline. A violent response might protect his reputation for a moment, but it could also attract police attention or escalate the rivalry into something much more dangerous. Waiting allowed him to understand the situation more clearly before making a decision. Some members of his inner circle understood that restraint was part of his strategy. They believed that Mitchell was allowing Moore's crew to reveal their intentions fully before responding. If Moore's group was preparing for a larger challenge, rushing into a fight too early might weaken the '69 mob. Outside observers, however, saw the situation differently. People on the streets often judged power by visible action. A leader who remained quiet while rivals entered his territory could easily appear uncertain. As the days passed, the absence of retaliation became the subject of conversation across East Oakland. Dealers from other groups watched carefully. They wanted to see whether Mitchell would defend his position or allow the challenge to continue. Rumors spread through neighborhoods, bars, and apartment complexes. Some people claimed that the balance of power in Oakland was beginning to change. Others believed the silence was temporary and that a larger response would eventually come. In reality, Felix Mitchell was studying the situation carefully. He knew that the streets were unpredictable. One wrong move could trigger violence that spread far beyond a single corner. By waiting, he could see how far Moore and other rivals were willing to push the challenge. Those who understood the environment recognized that patience could be a form of strength. But the streets rarely wait forever. As the tension between the '69 mob and the family continued to grow, the quiet test of power slowly moved the city toward something more dangerous. What began as a small act of disrespect was laying the foundation for a much larger conflict in Oakland's underground world. The next incident occurred a few weeks later in East Oakland, again on streets near the 69th Avenue San Antonio Village housing projects, the same area people called 69ville. Dealers connected to Milton Mickey Moore's organization continued selling heroin on corners that had long been controlled by the '69 mob. This time, the provocation was worse. Moore's crew did not only sell on those corners. They began approaching customers who normally bought from the '69 mob and offered lower prices. By cutting prices, they tried to pull buyers away from Mitchell's network. Price competition was rare in Oakland at that time. Felix Mitchell had spent years controlling the market and keeping prices stable. Moore's move was not just business. It was a direct challenge to Mitchell's authority. Again, Felix Mitchell remained restrained. He allowed his lieutenants to report what they saw, but he did not order immediate retaliation. He continued watching the situation carefully. Each incident increased Moore's confidence. Members of the family began to believe that Mitchell might not respond at all. The longer they operated without interference, the stronger that belief became. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. The next incident occurred several months later, again in East Oakland. Dealers connected to Moore's organization began expanding their activity beyond a few corners. They moved into additional blocks where the '69 mob had long controlled heroin sales. The provocation was growing. Customers who once depended on Mitchell's network could now buy drugs from multiple groups. Competition appeared openly on streets that had once been controlled by a single organization. Again, Felix Mitchell remained restrained. Instead of reacting with immediate violence, he continued observing the situation. His organization remained active, but he did not launch a direct attack against Moore's crew. Each new move increased Moore's confidence. The longer his group operated without serious consequences, the more they believed they could push further. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. The next incident occurred during a period of rising tension across the city. Members connected to rival organizations began speaking openly about the growing conflict between the '69 mob and the family. Small confrontations started appearing in different parts of Oakland. The provocation was now becoming public. Arguments between dealers happened in parking lots, apartment complexes, and street corners. Rumors spread that a larger conflict was approaching. Again, Felix Mitchell remained restrained. He continued focusing on maintaining control inside his own organization while watching the actions of his rivals. Those close to him understood that he was measuring every move carefully. But outside observers often misunderstood that patience. Each new rumor strengthened Moore's belief that he could challenge Mitchell's position in Oakland's drug trade. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. The next incident occurred in August 1980, when violence finally appeared. During the first week of that month, 3 people connected to Moore's organization were murdered. Their names were Vendisha Davis, Terry Hatter, and Charles Dorsey. The situation quickly grew darker. A few days later, 3 members of the same family disappeared. Ricky the Rocket Walker, his younger brother Roger Red Walker, and their sister-in-law Sandy Adamson were reported missing. The next morning, a jogger discovered their bodies on a grassy hillside near Skyline Boulevard in an Oakland Park area known as the Colorado Trail. 2 of the victims had plastic bags placed over their heads and died from suffocation. The 3rd victim had been shot in the back of the head. The killings shocked the city. Within a single week, 6 gang-related murders had occurred. Police later described the period as Bloody August. Federal witnesses later testified that members of Felix Mitchell's inner circle spoke about involvement in the killings. During the same week, Mitchell himself told an associate he had traveled to Los Angeles. The message behind the violence was clear. The quiet rivalry between organizations had become a deadly war. Each incident deepened the conflict and increased fear across Oakland. In environments like this, confidence and retaliation often grow together, creating cycles that are difficult to stop. Everything changed when the violence reached a level that shocked even those familiar with the drug trade. The discovery of the Walker family members on the hillside near Skyline Boulevard crossed a line. 3 people from the same family had been killed and left together in a public area. The scene was brutal and impossible to ignore. For many residents of Oakland, this moment showed how far the conflict had gone. What had begun as a fight for territory had now produced multiple killings within a single week. The murders became a symbol of the growing war between rival drug organizations. Authorities responded by opening investigations, but the immediate response remained limited. Witnesses were afraid to speak, and proving responsibility in gang-related killings was extremely difficult. As a result, the violence did not stop immediately. The lack of quick resolution sent another message through the streets. Rival groups saw that the conflict could continue without immediate consequences. From that moment, the outcome became inevitable. The rivalry between the '69 mob, the family, and other groups had moved beyond competition. The drug trade in Oakland had entered a period where violence, retaliation, and fear would shape the streets for years to come. That evening, Felix Mitchell spoke quietly. The news of the killings during what police later called Bloody August had spread across Oakland. People talked about the bodies found near Skyline Boulevard. They talked about the growing war between the '69 mob and rival groups. Inside his circle, the atmosphere had changed. Felix met with several of his closest lieutenants and trusted associates. These were men who had grown up around him in the San Antonio Village projects. They had helped build his organization from the early days when it was only a small group of friends trying to control a few corners. Now the stakes were much higher. The conflict with Milton Mickey Mo Moore's organization, along with pressure from other rivals like Funktown USA, had turned the streets of Oakland into a dangerous battlefield. Every move carried consequences. Felix did not shout. He did not deliver long speeches. Those who knew him understood that he rarely raised his voice when serious decisions were being made. Instead, he spoke calmly about the situation. He described the growing tension and the violence that had begun spreading through the city. He understood that the conflict could not remain unresolved forever. He did not make dramatic threats. He did not speak about revenge. Instead, he explained that the streets would soon reach a point where the struggle for control would decide itself. Rival groups had already pushed the conflict too far. Felix believed that the balance of power in Oakland would eventually settle, one way or another. Those listening to him understood the deeper meaning behind his words. They had worked beside him long enough to recognize his tone. When Felix spoke quietly about the future, it usually meant that events were already moving toward a conclusion. His associates did not ask many questions. They knew that once the situation reached that point, things rarely returned to the way they were before. The quiet conversation ended without drama. People left the room and returned to their responsibilities within the organization. But everyone who heard Felix that evening understood that the streets were approaching a moment of change. The conflict that had grown slowly over the years was now moving toward consequences that no one could easily stop. Years later, the final chapter of Felix Mitchell's life would unfold in a place far removed from the streets where his power had once been strongest. The setting of the final incident was not dramatic. It was an ordinary place inside Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, one of the most well-known prisons in the United States. The prison held men from across the country, many serving long sentences for serious crimes. By that time, Felix Mitchell had already been arrested, tried, and convicted for running his heroin empire. After years of investigation by the FBI, the DEA, and the Oakland Police Department, the courts had sentenced him to life in prison. Authorities believed they had finally removed the most powerful drug leader in Oakland. Inside the prison, life followed a routine schedule. Inmates woke early. They moved through the same hallways, ate in the same dining areas, and followed the same daily structure enforced by guards and prison rules. The environment was controlled and predictable. Compared to the chaotic streets of Oakland, prison life moved at a slower pace. The routines rarely changed. Felix Mitchell, once surrounded by luxury cars, armed bodyguards, and large crowds, now lived inside a small cell among hundreds of other inmates. There were no fur coats, no diamond jewelry, and no public displays of wealth. Only routine. Days passed quietly inside the prison walls. Conversations happened in low voices. Inmates moved from one part of the facility to another under constant supervision. To an outside observer, nothing unusual seemed to be happening. But prisons carry their own dangers. Conflicts between inmates can appear suddenly. Old rivalries, personal disputes, or hidden tensions can turn violent without warning. On August 21, 1986, the routine of Leavenworth continued as it normally did. Guards moved through their shifts. Prisoners followed their daily schedule. The facility operated the same way it had the day before. The ordinary nature of the setting made what happened next even more shocking. Inside the prison, Felix Mitchell was attacked by another inmate and stabbed to death. He was 31 years old. His 32nd birthday was only 2 days away. The man who had once controlled a powerful drug empire across multiple states died inside a prison facility far from the Oakland streets where his story had begun. There was no crowd. No luxury cars. No loyal followers standing nearby. Just a sudden act of violence inside a place designed to contain men who had already lived violent lives. The contrast between his past power and the quiet setting of his death made the moment unforgettable. The story of Felix Mitchell, which had begun in the neglected housing projects of East Oakland and grown into one of the most powerful drug operations in the country, had come to an abrupt and final end inside the walls of a federal prison. By the early 1980s, The rivalry between Felix Mitchell's 69 mob and the organizations competing against him had reached a point where open conflict could no longer be avoided. The quiet challenges of earlier years had grown into a violent struggle for power across Oakland streets. One of the strongest forces pushing this conflict was the network led by Milton "Mickey" Mo Moore. His group, known as the Family, had already moved into areas that once belonged completely to Mitchell's organization. What began as small acts of competition had slowly become open defiance. The final provocation came through a series of public moves that made the challenge impossible to ignore. Dealers connected to Moore's group continued operating openly on corners that had long been part of the 69 mob's territory. Customers saw both groups working in the same places. The message spread quickly through the streets of East Oakland. The control that Felix Mitchell had built over the heroin trade was now being tested in front of everyone. For years, Mitchell had maintained authority through discipline and organization. His system kept prices stable and reduced open competition between dealers. But Moore's actions disrupted that balance. This time, there was no ambiguity. Felix Mitchell was transported to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, a prison known for housing individuals convicted of serious federal crimes. The man who once moved through East Oakland surrounded by wealth and influence now entered a place defined by strict routine and confinement. His empire on the streets had ended. But the story that followed would prove that the consequences of his rise, and his removal, would continue shaping Oakland long after he was gone. Felix Mitchell did not live long after his conviction. On August 21, 1986, inside Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, another inmate attacked him with a knife. The attack happened suddenly inside the prison. Felix Mitchell died from the stabbing. He was 31 years old, only 2 days away from his 32nd birthday. The man who had once controlled a large heroin network across several states died inside a prison far away from the streets where his power had existed. But the story did not end with his death. The environment he had once controlled changed almost immediately. For years, Felix Mitchell had dominated the heroin market in Oakland. His organization kept prices stable and controlled who could sell drugs in certain neighborhoods. Rival gangs existed, but many avoided open conflict with the 69 mob because of Mitchell's influence. When he was removed from the streets, that system disappeared. Smaller groups rushed to fill the empty space. Dealers who had once worked under Mitchell began operating independently. Rival organizations moved into neighborhoods that had once been controlled by a single network. New gangs appeared, each trying to take control of territory. The result was chaos. Without one powerful organization controlling the market, the drug trade became fragmented. Multiple groups competed for the same corners. Prices dropped as dealers tried to attract more buyers. Cheaper drugs meant more customers. More customers meant more addiction. More addiction brought more desperation. And desperation often led to more crime. Violence also increased. When one organization controlled territory, conflicts were limited. But when many small groups fought for control of the same streets, shootings became more common. Turf wars spread across different parts of Oakland. Blocks that had once been quiet suddenly became contested areas. Rival dealers watched each other closely. Arguments turned into fights. Fights sometimes turned into shootings. The streets changed. Law enforcement had believed that removing Felix Mitchell would weaken the drug trade in Oakland. Instead, the opposite happened. The system he had controlled collapsed, and the environment became even more unstable. The message spread quickly across the city. People understood that the removal of one powerful figure had not ended the drug trade. Instead, it had created space for many smaller groups to compete. The message did not need to be repeated. Everyone could see the results in the rising violence and the growing number of dealers on the streets. In the years that followed, criminologists, investigators, and researchers studied what had happened in Oakland. When they reviewed the events surrounding Felix Mitchell's rise and fall, a clear pattern began to appear. First, there had been escalation. Felix Mitchell built a large and structured heroin network that controlled much of the city's drug trade. Rival groups eventually challenged his authority, leading to conflicts that included violent incidents like those during Bloody August in 1980. Second, There had been warnings. Investigators and community members had long known that the drug trade was deeply rooted in neighborhoods affected by poverty and neglect. The conditions that allowed criminal organizations to grow were already present long before Mitchell built his empire. Third, there had been system failure. The removal of Mitchell from the streets was meant to solve the problem. Authorities believed that arresting the leader of the largest drug organization would weaken the entire network. Instead, the system created a vacuum. Without a single dominant organization controlling prices and territory, the market fragmented into many smaller groups. Competition increased. Violence increased. Drug availability increased. Researchers later gave this phenomenon a name. They called it the Felix Mitchell Paradox. The idea was simple but unsettling. Sometimes, removing a powerful criminal leader does not immediately reduce crime. Instead, it can break an existing structure and create chaos as smaller groups fight for control. The pattern appeared in Oakland after Mitchell's arrest and death. Drug markets became less organized but more widespread. Violence became less predictable. Rival groups fought constantly for territory that had once been controlled by a single network. For investigators studying the case years later, the conclusion was unavoidable. Felix Mitchell had been responsible for building one of the most powerful drug operations in the region. But his removal alone could not solve the deeper problems that allowed that operation to exist in the first place. The environment that produced his rise still remained. And as long as those conditions continued, new figures would appear to take the place of those who came before them. Long after the death of Felix Mitchell, his story continued to circulate through Oakland and far beyond it. People remembered the unusual scenes connected to his life and death. They remembered the power he held over the streets of East Oakland. They remembered the violence that followed the wars between rival gangs. But the story continued not because of spectacle. It continued because of meaning. In August of 1986, only days after Felix Mitchell was killed in prison, his funeral took place in Oakland. The event shocked many people across the country. A horse-drawn glass carriage carried a bronze coffin worth $6,000 through the streets of East Oakland. On top of the coffin were flowers shaped like a dollar sign. Behind the carriage followed 14 white Rolls-Royce limousines, stretching so far down the street that some witnesses said they could not see the end of the procession. More than 8,000 people came to watch. Television cameras recorded the funeral. Reporters tried to explain what they were seeing. Many had never witnessed anything like it before. The crowd included community members, curious residents, and even well-known public figures such as Black Panther co-founder Huey P. Newton. To some observers, the funeral looked like the farewell for a political leader or a famous public figure. But the man being buried was a drug dealer who had grown up in the housing projects. For many residents of East Oakland, the funeral represented something deeper than the life of one man. It showed the complicated relationship between the community and the system around it. Felix Mitchell had flooded the streets with heroin. His organization had brought addiction and violence into the neighborhood. But at the same time, he had also provided money, gifts, and opportunities that many residents had never received from official institutions. He sponsored youth programs. He gave toys and food to children. He donated money to local causes. This contradiction created a complicated legacy. Some people remembered him as a criminal who damaged the community. Others remembered him as someone who helped people when few others did. His story continued to appear in music, documentaries, and conversations about the history of Oakland. Rappers such as Too Short later mentioned him in their lyrics. Television programs examined his rise and fall. Writers and criminologists studied his influence on the drug trade. But the reason his story lasted was not simply because he had been powerful. It lasted because his life exposed something uncomfortable about the society around him. Felix Mitchell did not rise from wealth or privilege. He rose from a housing project where opportunity was scarce and where many people felt ignored by the systems meant to protect and support them. In places like that, power sometimes grows in unexpected ways. When legitimate opportunities disappear, other systems appear to replace them. Sometimes those systems are built by people who break the law. Sometimes those people become leaders within communities that feel abandoned. The story of Felix Mitchell became a reminder of how complicated that reality can be. His life showed how one man could be both feared and admired at the same time. It showed how crime can grow in environments where poverty and neglect remain unresolved. And it showed how removing a single person does not always solve the larger problems that created that person's rise. Even decades later, the streets of Oakland still remember the name Felix Mitchell. Not because of the luxury cars. Not because of the diamonds or the fur coats. But because his story forced people to ask difficult questions about power, crime, and the conditions that allow both to grow. In the end, when a system fails long enough, the line between villain and leader can disappear.